While checking over our Mini for its upcoming MOT and actually filming the whole process for last week's video that I'll leave in the cards above if you haven't seen it already, I noticed that its reversing lights weren't working. I even have a clip of me putting it in reverse and reversing the car backwards, and still no lights came on. So I thought that I would film the process of the steps that I took to diagnose and fix that issue so that hopefully you can either repair this exact issue if you happen to have an R50 Mini, or you can use these steps as a more general guide for how to go about repairing, well, this sort of issue. My first thought was to check the bulb, which in most automotive lighting situations is the common failure point and is the thing that you normally need to replace. So, and I should make it clear that most cars, or at least the most ones that I've seen, generally only have one reverse light bulb. It's normally the only section of your rear taillights that are clear rather than orange or red, although in this Mini's case, it actually has two, one in each side. To get at a Mini's rear lights, you can do it in two ways. In theory, you can do it all from inside the car without any tools at all, which is great, especially if you just want to swap out the bulb. But since I wanted to do a little bit of diagnostics, I opted to take the housing out of the back. Now, either way, what you'll need to do is unclip the side panels that are inside the boot. It's just two little plastic tab or clips at the top that you pull down, pull the tab out, and the panel will drop away. Then, if you just want to get at the bulbs, you can reach in and there's two clips sort of horizontally that you'll squeeze together and pull the sort of backplane type thing off with all of the bulbs attached. If, however, like me, you want to remove the rear housing, then you'll only need a long 10mm socket to remove the 10mm nut that's on the fairly long stud. Once you remove that, you can then push the housing out of the back. You might need to reach around to the outer side to push the very large metal tabs in to pop it out, but overall, once that comes out, you can then detach that backplane type thing with all of the bulbs in it, again just by squeezing those two clips together. You can then put the housing down to one side or in the boot and check the bulbs themselves. The reverse light bulbs are just pressed in, so carefully pull them out of the socket. And if you have a multimeter, then this is a really good time to use it. You can check continuity between the two wires that are coming out, as if there is no continuity, then the bulb is broken, but if there is, or especially if there's a good circuit between them, then you could assume that the bulb is at least somewhat functional. You can also do this by just looking at it if you don't have a multimeter. If you can see the filament is nicely attached to both sides, then it's likely that the bulb is okay, whereas if you can see that it's got a hard break in it or the filament wire is just missing, then that's more likely a burnt up bulb. In my case, the bulb was perfectly fine, so I checked the other side just for good measure. Now, in theory, especially because there is two bulbs here, it's really unlikely that both would have failed at the same time, at least in the grand scheme of things, and so it's more likely that there is some other culprit. But since it's so easy to check the bulbs themselves, I figured that I would check them just in case. Now, in my case, both bulbs were perfectly fine. So I did one other test before putting it all back together, which is I had my partner start the car, put it into reverse, and I used my multimeter to check if there was any voltage at the bulb, at the two pins, the two sort of metal leads that come down on that sort of backplane connector type thing. In my case, there wasn't. So that means that it's not necessarily a problem with the bulbs, it's just they're not being sent a signal to turn on. So if it's not the bulbs that are broken, what is? Well, much like your brake lights, your reverse lights have a physical switch or sensor to tell them to be turned on or to activate them. In some cars' case, it might be slightly different than what I'm about to explain, but in many cars' case, it is a physical little switch that is screwed into the side of your gearbox. In this Mini's case, it's one of these tiny little sensors. It just physically gets pushed in by a little tab inside the gearbox when you go to put it into reverse. And it's my understanding that these little switches are fairly prone to failure on these Minis, so this is what we'll be replacing. I want to preface this repair section by saying that, at least for this Mini, this little switch is relatively easy to get at and to replace, and I would argue that it's one of the best jobs for getting some experience in fixing, things that go wrong with your car. It only takes a couple of tools to get at this, and only about 20 minutes or so, maybe half an hour if you're a bit more nervous about things, but it's remarkably easy and it's a really great way to get some confidence and experience in replacing things on your car and save yourself a whole lot of money in the process. So how do you actually replace this? And probably a better question, where even is it? Well, the reason that I like this job for being relatively easy is that you don't need to get under the car at all. All you will need to do is work in the engine bay, and actually in one of the easier to access sides of the engine bay, so it's a nice and easy job. The first thing you want to do is open the bonnet, which you'll do by lifting the lever that's in the driver's side footwell, and then use the little yellow lever that's just to the left-hand side of the right headlight if you're looking at the car from the front. You'll lift that lever up and then you can lift the full bonnet out of the way. And where this little sensor is on the right-hand side of the engine bay as you look at it, and on the front side of the gearbox. It is hidden under the airbox, which we will need to remove, but we only need to undo 4 bolts to get there, so it's nice and easy to get to. First things first, you'll likely want to lift the battery cover just out of the way slightly. It just gets slightly in the way of some of the bolts that we need to get to, so you can unclip it at the side and at the front and lift it up. You might need to move the little bit of weather stripping, but it's all good. Then you'll want to unclip the top of the airbox. Now, luckily, we actually don't need to remove the one-time use hose clamp that connects the top piece of the airbox to that rubber tube that comes off of it on the left. We can actually leave the top of the airbox where it is. It makes things a little bit more difficult if you're willing to replace that clip and even just use a standard Jubilee clip instead. That's all good, you certainly can, but to keep things simple, all you'll need to do is unscrew the captive 8mm screws that are on the right hand side of the airbox, one at the front and one towards the back. Might be hidden under some cables, but once you unscrew them, like I said, they're captive to the top half of the airbox, so they don't come all the way out. Once you've unscrewed them, you can lift up the airbox from that side and then slide it off of the clips that are on the left-hand side of it to lift it out of the way. You might need to unclip the cables that are clipped into that airbox, or especially the top side of it. But once that's out, you can then lift your air filter up and out of the airbox. This also counts as a guide if you ever need to replace your engine air filter, which again is really easy to do. It's literally just 2 little bolts, so nice and easy. But once that's out of the way, you'll then need a 10mm socket to remove the bolt that is on the holds the lower half of the airbox to the frame rail, which is on the right hand side in a little sort of cup, if you like. You'll remove that out and keep it to one side nice and safe. And then you'll also want to remove another 10mm bolt that's on the back side of the airbox, so the lower half of the airbox. That's quite a short bolt, so do make sure that once you take it out, you don't drop it down into the engine bay, as it might be a little bit difficult to find. But once that's out and you've fished it out of the way, you'll then be able to work that lower half of the airbox out of the engine bay. You might find it helpful to have a friend to hold some things out of the way for you as you're pulling things apart, but the first thing you will need to do is unclip all of the cables and connectors that are stuck to that lower half of the airbox. Then you'll need to slide the airbox towards the back of the car, off of the pipe or the air intake that is just in the front side. Once you have that off, you'll then be able to carefully wiggle the lower half of the airbox out of the engine bay. It might take some trial and error to make sure that you don't catch or rip any of the cables, especially along the backside, and to get it clear of the top of the airbox, you might need to pull it back slightly. But once it's out of the way, the sensor is right there for us to get access to. You'll see it on the front side of the airbox with its little wire and connector coming off, and you will need to remove that electrical connector. It has a little wire clip around the top of it that you'll need to squeeze in effectively down onto the plug itself, and then you'll be able to pull the plug backwards and off of our sensor. Once the connector is off, you can then unscrew the switch. It is a 19mm socket head, so you can either use a socket or a spanner. If you're using a spanner, I would recommend using one with an angled 12-point section to it, as you'll have some difficulty in getting enough space and enough room to turn it around. With the box end, as especially with the box end, you might strip the nut surface itself, and with 12-point, it gives you more steps to move it around in. If you're using a socket, which I would generally recommend, you'll likely need a deep socket to be able to clear the electrical connector that's on the back. Unfortunately, all of my deep sockets were just a little bit too long, at least the 19mm ones, and so I wasn't able to use that personally to get it off. In theory, if you're willing to remove the intake pipe, which is just clipped in and held in by a few little, effectively cable ties with wiring, then you will have plenty of space to use a socket there. But for me, I have the angled spanners that work perfectly fine, so I used those. I found that as soon as I got it loose, it was then loose enough to just unscrew by hand, and so I did, which made it a lot quicker and easier. Once it's out, you can then check the old part and the new part to make sure that they are the same. I'll include the model number or the part number for the replacement that I bought. I think it's a TORFAN or TOPFAN 500-536 specifically, and that is the one for the Mini Cooper non-S, the 1.6 non-supercharged, and the manual, and the R50, which is from 2001 to 2006. You can then screw the new parts in by hand and get it as snug as you can, and then ideally you would use a socket and a torque wrench to tighten it to 25 Newton meters or 18.5 foot-pounds as the repair manual suggests. Although, if you're using a spanner, then getting it as tight as it was when you removed it, or basically just nice and snug, not too tight that you want to snap this or anything, but just snug enough that it's not going to unscrew itself and fall out. Once it's in and tight, you can then reconnect the electrical connector, which only goes on one way, so just slide it on and you should hear a click as it seats into place. And then you can drop the air filter box back down, which you will need to be careful to fish it in well and not catch any of the cables, especially on the back side. But once you do fiddle it in, you can then slide it down onto the air intake pipe that you took it off from earlier. You can then reinstall both the screw down at the back and the one on the right hand side. Again, just nice and snug and tight so that they're not going to fall out. Then drop your air filter back in, take the top half of the airbox and reattach it, attaching on the clips on the left hand side and then holding it down and installing the two screws, the 8mm bolts essentially, that should still be in the top half of the airbox. And then reinstall your battery cover, and might need to reposition the weather stripping, and then that's it. You can go and test it, and if all is well, then your lights should now be working. I bought the replacement parts just on eBay for, I think it was £8, and if you wanted to go call up your local Mini or BMW dealership and talk to the parts department, I'm sure that they would sell you it for possibly even less. Now, the thing is, if you were to take that Mini to the Mini dealer without having done any of this work or even the diagnostics to work out what's wrong, there's a good chance that you would be walking away with a bill for potentially well over £100 to have this little sensor diagnosed and then fixed, and you're paying for both parts and labour to get that done. So you could either pay £8 for the replacement sensor and spend 20 or 30 minutes getting some experience on fixing these sorts of little things on your car. Or you could pay well over 100 and potentially be out of your car, or even just, sat in the dealership for even longer than 20 or 30 minutes. For me, I would argue that's a pretty reasonable trade-off or investment. And like I said, this is a relatively easy job that gets you acquainted with these sorts of little fixes for your car so that you can feel more, empowered to actually go and fix something if it goes wrong, save yourself some money, and if you get stranded or something breaks, then you can go and fix it without necessarily needing to have someone to immediately come and help you. But with that said, those are both my thoughts and the guide on how to replace a Mini's reverse light switch. If you have any questions or thoughts yourself, then do feel free to leave those in the comments down below. There will be plenty of other videos on the end cards you can check out, from guides like this one to car reviews, including the review of that Mini itself. If you have any questions, like I said, leave those in the comments down below. If you want to see more videos like this one on a weekly basis, then hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notification icon. And I'll leave the part number, I'll leave that in either a comment or in the description so that you can just go and Google it if you need that exact part yourself. Otherwise, thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, we'll see you on the next video.